a lot of you are in this industry. Assume you're just legislators, state legislators, and if there are any here, I don't mean to be, dismissive, but they have no clue, okay? So the first thing you have to convince them of, the more you demand, and California's, as Jim mentioned, is in the process of demanding a much higher renewable portfolio and reducing gasoline use by 50% and increasing, doubling energy efficiencies. And it all sounds beautiful, and it is beautiful, but somebody's got to do it, but not them. But if you approach them in a way, and this is where the translators come in, and by the way, Jim was a good translator from Jonathan, and we'll continue this process. If you can explain to them that we need a very, very controlled grid, and it used to be baseline, so it was relatively easier to do. We need clean air, so that you guys are pushing us in that direction. The one thing you need to learn is that if it falls apart, there are consequences for politicians. No California governor ever got recalled until the energy crisis basically was incomprehensible to Californians, and the handling of it was like literally, there was no way to handle it. He had no concept, and it was just a mess. Once you get that concept through to the chairman of the energy or utilities or that sort of thing, they'll pay a little bit more attention. And if you can show them a way to get cleaner fuels and reliability, which is a pretty major trick, and we just heard snippets of it that make my heart get nervous. But it is doable, but the key is you got to do it outside of California. You can't rely on California to solve this problem. You only make it deeper the more you try to do it in California. So I have been carrying that message as everybody here, and I must once again thank Lloyd for really pushing that ball and all the people in this panel. But if politicians understand that the diversity is going to keep this thing in balance, and they don't get clocked in the head when the grid collapses, that's when you start to get their attention. It's very complicated to explain it to them. So now I'm going to go to our next speaker, who is a practitioner in the field, no less complicated. Jan Strack works at PG&E, also a longtime field hand out there. It's a tough job. I just want to go over a couple of things. In 1985, by the way, I think Jan he's born, you're in Southern California, aren't you? No?
From the Midwest.
Oh, okay. So I really think the bottom line for him was surfing. It's similar to skiing, but it's a lot warmer, and it's a lot of similarities. But I think he's adopted the Southern California lifestyle. And he has noted here he's a battle-scarred veteran. That goes back to the Gray Davis and the breakdown and all the things that Jim was also a battle-scarred veteran in. And he's one of the people who are in the field trying to make this stuff work, and probably wringing his hands and pulling his hair and gnashing his teeth every time he reads the paper about what the legislature is up to. But he is, again, one of those engineering people who understand this stuff, and I got to hand it to him. But what really caught my attention here is at the very bottom of his resume, or the bio, he tells hilarious jokes that his wife finds uninteresting. And I gotta say that when I think about that, I thought about it for a moment, I think that's one of the definitions of an engineer. It's engineering humor, and it's hilarious to engineers, and everybody says, no. There's only one, there's no cure for that disease, but there is one way to mitigate it: marry another engineer who actually gets it. So I'm gonna turn it over now to Jan, who's gonna comment on these two things, and will be the practitioner that helps pull it together.
Well, thank you. Just by way of clarification, I actually work for San Diego Gas and Electric, a little further south. San Diego is a long way from Wyoming, too far to walk, and which is a good thing because I had a little trouble with my knee. Carl Zakella, my good friend from the National Resources Defense Council, and I were commiserating about our knees problems there too, and reminded me that about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I started having a lot of trouble with my right knee, an old basketball injury, swelled up like a balloon. Really, I could hardly walk there for a couple of days, but it turns out where I was traveling, I was with a couple of my friends who are doctors. One of them is an emergency room doctor. The other one is a expert forensic pathologist. Well, anyway, I'm in misery, and I'm thinking, well, I'm just going to ask the doctors to come down and give me a free visit here and tell me what the hell's going on with my knee. So I asked the ER doctor down, and I pulled up my leg, showed him the balloon there, and he kind of poked at it. And then he looked at me and he said, well, I don't see any blood. It's still attached. I can't help you. So that was a little disappointing. So then I called my forensic pathologist doctor down to see if I could get a second opinion. And then he came down and he looked at it from a second, but then he took his hand and he put it on my chest. And then he turned to me and said, your heart's beating. I can't help you. So, but anyway, I managed to survive. It's a little better now. And I'm really glad to be here, actually. I really like Wyoming. I've been here a number of times. It's the one state that I know of where people use the terms oil, gas, coal, and wind without hesitation or embarrassment in the same sentence. So it's a pretty interesting group. So anyway, thank you for inviting me. Lloyd asked me to talk about the NREL study, actually, which is a study that was done about a year ago. And it was asking the question, is there an economic case to be made for Wyoming wind being delivered into California? And when you ask that question, there's some threshold issues that you got to deal with. Obviously, capital cost is a big one. Performance characteristics of the renewables, we've heard some of that from the other speakers already. The reliability impacts of those renewables. And of course, we got to think about the transmission costs. So these are all issues that the NREL study looked into. And so I'm going to give you a really quick, high-level overview of this with a few of my own little observations about that study. Now, we start out with the California Renewable Portfolio Standard, because we're delivering the stuff into California. We got a 20% goal by, I think it's 2020, actually. But the study here is focused on the numbers for 2022. The renewable net short in 2022 is about 32,000 gigawatt hours. That's as of when the study was done. And just so you understand, the renewable net short is essentially a simple calculation where you take the total renewable requirement of 33% of retail sales in California, subtract off the existing renewables plus what's under construction. What's left over is called the renewable net short. So that's what the study was targeting at, was the 32,000 gigawatt hours. Now, it turns out that pretty much all of that, as of right now, is fully contracted. And at the time NREL did the study, they recognized that. So what they did for their study purposes was they assumed that there's 12,000 gigawatt hours out of that 32,000 would not get developed by 2022 as a result of contract delay or failure. And you can see the numbers there, the percentages by energy. A lot of it's geothermal, a lot solar PV, a little solar thermal, and some wind, that's mainly California wind. Now, this is important because the stuff that you're displacing establishes what the economic value of the Wyoming wind is, which is what you're using to replace it with. So in the study, they replaced it with the 12,000 gigawatt hours of Wyoming wind, which was nominally about 3,000 megawatts of installed wind capacity. Next one. They also did a sensitivity case. I'm not going to spend much time with this, only because the sensitivity case essentially showed the same results as this baseline 33% case. The one thing about this particular case was recognizing that a lot of those renewables that are already under contract, the permitting for the ones that weren't yet constructed, there are a number of those that started the permitting process, and they're considered core projects. And so the question here was, well, if those are actually going to get built, then we have to push into a mix of renewables, which is a little less economically attractive. And so in this case, they added about 4,800 gigawatt hours of additional renewable energy, which gets you up to the 35% case. But again, the results of this one were similar, so I'm not going to spend much time with that. Go ahead. This is just a pictorial way of showing the same thing. If you look at the left-hand column there, this is what the PUC actually develops for California. And it's what the California ISO actually uses in their transmission planning process. If you add up the numbers of what's called the core projects, things that are going to be in service before 2015, it's 14,000. After 2015, there's 11,000. Then things that don't have permitting underway, there's about 7,000 of that. So if we get to a total of 32,000. The two middle columns there is the two columns that actually get compared in the analysis. So the first column is sort of our reference case. It's the California 33% portfolio. And as you can see down there towards the bottom of those two middle ones, right in there, there's the 4891 of core projects and the 7109 of non-core projects, things that haven't started permitting. and they're replacing those with the 12,000 gigawatt hours of Wyoming wind. So that's just basically how the modeling is set up. They're comparing that first column against that second column. Okay. Now, just my own perspective here, again, this all kind of presumes a fair amount of contract failure. I think that's, you have to wonder about that. Some people, and we have some discussions about this today, and are not sure that this is really accurate, but some people are thinking we're actually approaching a 40% contract rate in California. And that's due to a couple of things. One of the big drivers right now is that our retail sales consumption forecasts are a lot lower. And I think that's due to a couple of things. Certainly the recession cut into load growth, and the effects of that have been pretty persistent. There's been, people learn to conserve and they don't forget. The other thing, of course, is that appliances and buildings are increasingly efficient. If you think about the big flat screen TVs that we used to buy compared to the new ones, huge difference in energy consumption. So we're seeing slower end-use load growth to begin with. On top of that, we've got a huge amount of behind-the-load meter rooftop solar PV. And in California, you probably know that there's huge rate incentives for doing this for the customer, because a customer can put rooftop solar on their house, and if they put enough up there, they can actually offset their entire electric bill, not just the commodity portion, but they can offset all the retail distribution and transmission costs as well. So there's a huge incentive to do this. I think in San Diego, we've already got something like 350 megawatts of rooftop solar. So that's another significant reduction in retail sales. So you got those two things combined. In addition, renewable technologies are maturing. You're getting, the developers are more sophisticated. The construction techniques are a lot better. The panel prices, as you know, have been dropping. And so as a result of all that, the contract failure rates have dropped. All of which is to say, we're pretty well contracted at pretty high levels, even through year 2022. Okay. So what does this mean? Well, in my view, we got to think about Wyoming wind in a little different context. First of all, I think we have to think longer term. After year 22 is what I said here, but longer term generally. There's other ways to think about Wyoming wind. Of course, if the California RPS requirement goes up, and they're talking about 50% in the legislature right now by 2030, that would drive a need for more renewables. Likewise, there's legislative talk. Again, this is all discussions about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the numbers are 80% below the 1990 level historically by the year 2050. But again, this is all a big driver for non-emitting technologies like wind. And you can never forget about just the fact that while natural gas prices, as we heard today, are extremely low, I don't think it's prudent to think they're always going to remain that low. And if they do rise, there certainly could be a case made that just a head-on competition against existing natural gas, wind can make a lot of economic sense. And I would add to this list, which I should have done, I didn't, because I know that here in Wyoming, people think 111D is kind of a mirage, but it could actually help offset some 111D impacts. This gives you just a sense of what we're talking about in terms of magnitude. I just threw this in here so people can get kind of a feel for the relative scope of the numbers. The top part up there shows what the ISO's forecast hourly loads are for year 2024. And you can see that the minimum load, the lowest load hour of the entire year, is a little under 20,000 megawatts under this projection. And then in contrast, at the bottom there, I plotted 3,000 megawatts of Wyoming wind with a typical profile. And so the point being here that there's an awful lot of energy that could be supplied by wind or other technologies. And as you would, of course, know, there's a lot of other stuff that competes for that baseload portion. A lot of other generators competing for that. And there is, of course, as Jim would point out, some little operational issues you have to consider too. So maybe this could be slightly oversimplified. But I just want to give people a sense of the scope we're talking about here. Okay. Now, as I said, in the study, there's sort of two main components here. One is the capital cost savings of building Wyoming wind, and the other one is the energy savings. So let's start with the capital cost savings. First of all, the NREL study showed that there's a significant capital cost savings if we replace a mix of California renewables with the Wyoming wind. And the main reason for this is, not surprisingly, with the higher capacity factor in Wyoming wind, it takes a lot less generation infrastructure to produce the same amount of energy as it would to do California wind and California solar. And you can see there that the capacity factors for wind and solar in California, of course, are much lower than the Wyoming wind. Another factor is it actually costs a lot less to build things out here. So that's another reason that there's a bigger capital cost savings. Another reason is that we're offsetting in the NREL study some of the geothermal costs, and geothermal is a very expensive capital cost technology, so you get capital cost savings there. The NREL analysis does make the assumption that production tax credit ends, but the 10% ITC remains. This has a tendency to favor the Wyoming wind a little bit because it makes the California mix look a little more expensive when you make that assumption, but I think that is a reasonable assumption. And then the other part, I'm going to talk about this in a moment, which is there is some savings offset going on here because it turns out the Wyoming wind profile is actually contributes less to reliability than the California profile does, and I'll explain that in a moment. Okay. So here's the capital cost numbers, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. NREL did a reference case and a sensitivity case because the capital cost numbers are obviously fairly uncertain to some extent there. You can see a range on the high side on the left, which is the reference case, and then for the most part they lowered them on the right-hand side. I would say that the solar thermal number on the right-hand side is higher there because they assumed the addition of storage, but they also assumed a much higher capacity factor for that solar thermal resource, so that's accounted for in the production cost analysis. And you can see the wind, you're getting down into the $1,700 to $1,500 range in dollar per kilowatt, and we've actually seen offers coming in those areas, so these are very reasonable numbers in my view. And I also went back and just looked at the more recent estimates from the WECC Transmission Expansion Planning Policy Committee, just to give a comparison. They're pretty comparable across the board. And again, I would say, if anything, their NREL numbers are a little actually lower than what TEPSI would estimate. But I think they're reasonable anyway. Go ahead. So now let me talk about the capacity value that I mentioned earlier about the reliability piece. So it turns out the Wyoming wind has a lower capacity value. What does that mean, a low reliability value? What it really means is, on an annual basis, solar actually has a better coincidence with the periods of time when the reliability risk is highest in the California mix. So as a result of that, NREL added about 925 megawatts of gas turbine capacity to the Wyoming wind case so that the two mixes of renewables were on an equivalent level of reliability. And they assessed a cost for that additional gas turbine capacity, $800 a kilowatt. So this is actually a negative capacity savings, if you will. Okay. On the energy savings side, okay, so they ran some production cost analysis of both the California mix and the Wyoming mix. And I think not surprisingly, they found the results were actually not too different. There's not a lot of savings here. And the reason is because you're using exactly the same amount of energy, renewable energy in both cases. Now the timing of the energy is different, but the amounts are the same. That timing difference does impart a little bit of a savings, mainly due to the more efficient unit commitment. And I think Jim mentioned that earlier in his little talk. So there's a small benefit here, but it's not really great. Go ahead. Lastly, on the savings side, we got transmission capital cost savings. So if you're going to replace the entire, or you're going to replace a substantial portion of the California renewable mix with Wyoming wind, then the transmission costs that go along with that mix of renewables in California could be displaced as well. And I think NREL used these estimates from some work the Cal ISO had done, comes up to like $332 million per year on a levelized basis. But they also recognize that these are all conceptual type transmission improvements. They actually are contingent on interconnection studies. They're contingent on future transmission planning work by the ISO. So as a conservative assumption, they did a sensitivity where they basically just assume that there is no displacement of that transmission, that it would be built anyway for some reason. So they've got a range there of transmission capital cost savings with lower bound to zero. Okay. And of course, we have to account for the cost. For this project, the NREL made the assumption that there'd be a DC transmission line with the two converter stations at either end. from eastern Wyoming down to El Dorado in south of Las Vegas. The reason I think El Dorado is selected is because it's well connected to the Southern California load centers via transmission between Southern Nevada and the Los Angeles Basin. The cost of that line was estimated at $3 billion. Of course, there could be other transmission expansion options, and they certainly have been proposed and talked about to access Wyoming wind. When you're talking about numbers like 3,000 megawatts of additional wind in the state of Wyoming, there simply isn't the existing infrastructure available to get that out of the state without a lot of expensive cost in terms of congestion. So that's the transition. Okay, so let's go ahead. So now to the result. And I'm going to go line by line here. First of all, you got the capital cost savings, 6.4 billion to 10.9 billion. The 6.4, the lower number being if you assume lower capital costs, the higher 10.9 billion being if you assume NREL's higher capital costs. Then, of course, you've got the negative benefit, which is the additional gas turbine capacity that was required to bring the two portfolios up to an equivalent level of system reliability. Then we've got the relatively small production cost savings. It's actually 0.3 billion. Then, as I just mentioned, you've got the avoided transmission, which is anywhere from 0 to 2.7, depending what you want to assume. The present value of the transmission to get it out of Wyoming was 3.6. So you add up all the totals, you get a gross benefit of 5.9 to 13.1 billion, and you get to a net benefit then of 2.3 to 9.5 after you subtract out the cost of the new line. Now, I guess I would just sort of close at this point with just the observation that, and this is what I always try to impress upon people, that whenever you see a savings number, a net savings number, this is always a very good thing for consumers. These are California consumers that would actually enjoy the savings. And when people enjoy an economic savings, what does that really mean? Well, it means you've got more money in your wallet. And when you have more money in your wallet, what do? Well, people spend that money. And what do you do what happens when you spend money? You create more jobs. So in the end, I always try to impress upon people that whenever you can make a case for something that's more economic, you actually just created more jobs. So California's propensity to try to draw a wall around where the employment is, I think is misguided. And so I don't think I'm teaching the choir here, I know. But I always, in all of my talks, I try to impress upon people that you always want to do the efficient thing, because in the end, that's better for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that it?
I think I'll stop there because I think John and Jim already covered the rest of the material.
Stop on the bottom line there.
Thank you particularly for that last bottom line. That is the big issue in California about where the jobs are going to be produced. And the legislation that we were talking about also has a special benefit for creating jobs in California, but they don't put it into a larger context, which is something we really need to do here. So I'm looking forward to the next speaker, Jeff Lambert, who, when you look at these bios, I can tell he's important because his is one of the shortest, and those are the ones you got to watch out for. He's been around quite as long as the other guys, but he is the director of finance. I'm sure every one of you know that, for the power company of Wyoming and Transverse Express. So I know I'm going to listen up, and I'm sure you all will. What I found most interesting, the background all made sense to me, but this is a guy who was in the Navy, and he was a fighter pilot, and I guess he decided to get into something more interesting, which was the world of finance, and more exciting, something that a fighter pilot is generally looking for. So I'm looking forward to the approach, and I really am also looking forward to how the projects that you are involved in are doing. We're really close to my heart.
Thank you very much. I'm going to grab the... So just one clarification, I was an attack pilot, not a fighter pilot, but I want to hold that against you.
That sounds like a fighter to me.
Okay, so first just a little bit of taxonomy here. We have the power company Wyoming, and that's the development company that's developing the wind project, and Transverse Express is developing the transmission project. Both of these companies are subsidiaries of the Anschutz Corporation, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Anschutz Corporation, but it has a long history of oil and gas development, hospitality and entertainment venues, and other large infrastructure projects. Both of these projects represent an investment of around $6 billion in the state of Wyoming, and represent almost about 7 million man-hours of construction jobs. So first we'll talk a little bit about the wind project. It's called the Chokecherry and Sierra Madre Energy Project, otherwise known as the CCSM project. It's located between Saratoga, let's see, trying to get the light. Okay. Okay, so Saratoga's down, so you have Interstate 80 right here. Saratoga's down here, Rollins is here, kind of split the difference. That's where the ranch is located. It's on the Overland Trail Cattle Company Ranch, which is about 320,000 acres. Roughly 50% of that is federal land, which is denoted on this map here as the yellow checkerboards. Because of the federal land component, we had to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, otherwise known as the NEPA process, which we'll touch on a little bit later. We've made quite a lot of progress there, and so far we've been approved to install up to 1,000 turbines. Based on our current technology of turbines available, we're looking at about 3,000 megawatts of nominal nameplate rating. That project would produce 12 million megawatt hours per year of energy, which is roughly enough power to take care of the needs of around 1.2 million homes. If you look at the map on the lower right-hand side of the paper here, this is shows the wind resources. Blue is really, really, really windy, and red is really windy. And the tan color is not so windy. So the white outline shows where we have our two kind of project areas. Most of the turbines end up on the left-hand side to take care of that wind. I know we've heard a lot about capacity factor. We've got over 7 years of wind data, and our production models show that our project, you know, a real project, not a theoretical project, would produce energy with capacity factors over 45%. With that, how many of you really understand a capacity factor? Okay, I got a pretty low number there, but so the way I understand capacity factor is if you take the number of hours in a year, how much of that is the energy, is the project producing energy? So our project, our market is the desert Southwest, Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, and those wind projects have roughly a 30% capacity factor. Our project with a 45% capacity factor, it doesn't really sound like a big deal. It sounds like it's 15% difference. Going from a 30% capacity factor to a 45% capacity factor is a 50% increase in energy production. So our project here is going to cost $5 billion. So if you build it in Wyoming, you get $5 billion, you're going to get 12 million megawatt hours of energy. If you built it in California, it costs you $5 billion, maybe a little bit more, but you'd only get 8 million megawatt hours of energy. So roughly 2/3 the energy for the same price. That difference there is really the economics that Jan just talked about. That difference there really justifies building the transmission line. So that's the next project we'll talk about here. Okay, so this is the Transverse Express transmission line. It's a 730-mile HVDC line that starts in Rollins, Wyoming, goes down through Colorado, through Utah, right next to the Intermountain Power Project, down through Las Vegas. Just south of Las Vegas, there's a big energy trading hub called the El Dorado Valley. Jan had mentioned that earlier, but that's pretty much where the bulk of all the Southern California transmission substations are located. This project is going to cost $3 billion, also noted in the NREL study, and $1 billion of that investment is going to be in Wyoming with the Northern HVDC terminal. This route used roughly 2/3 of federal land, and we tried to use a lot of the existing transmission corridors, but because of the federal land component, we also had to comply with the NEPA process. Okay, so we do have some exciting news. In April, the Stork dropped off a package. It weighed 16 pounds, was 2,550 pages long, and was the final environmental impact statement for our transmission project. I also had another little delivery, which has been keeping me up at night, but I was really happy to get a full night's sleep last night.
You getting sleep?
Last night I did. So just to put this in context, I'll talk about transmission first. We started this in 2008. We filed a right-of-way application. In 2011, 2012, the Obama administration formed what they called the Rapid Response Transmission Team, which was initiative to streamline the permitting process. In 2010, Western Area Power Administration joined us, and they took the role as joint lead with the BLM, and they've really been instrumental in helping us achieve the final EIS, which we have just got. We're not quite done yet. We still have a little bit more work to do. The final EIS, there's a 90-day comment period, and then we should have a record of decision. Once we have a record of decision, the Forest Service will then issue a record of decision. Once we have both of those, then we would be eligible for the right-of-way grants and special use permit from the Forest Service, which will essentially and fully entitle the project so that we could start construction. So we anticipate that probably mid-2016. On the wind side, once again, 2008, we filed our application. In 2012, we received our record of decision. However, the record of decision was, although it was a good milestone, it was really just the approval of general wind development. So the analogy is if you had a subdivision that got approved, that's the record of decision. But in order to build a house, you have to have detailed architect and engineering plans. So the BLM calls this an environmental assessment. So we've been going through the environmental assessment process, which has taken almost 4 years. But that has, we've recently in December received our decision record on the infrastructure, which is the haul road, a rock quarry, and a rail delivery facility. Most of the turbine components are going to be delivered by rail for this project. We have the first 500 turbines. We're waiting on the decision record, which we should have sometime this summer. I'd also point out that we've had to redesign the project numerous times to be conscious of the habitat of sage-grouse and eagles. We have a pretty extensive sage-grouse monitoring program. We've collected over 500,000 data points on sage-grouse, and we're working with the the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop an eagle conservation plan, and we're in the process of obtaining an eagle take permit. We expect to have our draft EIS sometime this summer, final EIS and record of decision on the eagle take permit later this year, early 2016. So hopefully by mid-2016, this project will also be ready to be built. So here's another little perspective on timeline. So right here, this is when we filed our first right-of-way applications. This is when Western joined us on the transmission project. Here we received the draft EIS for our wind project. Here we received our final EIS and record of decision for the wind project. Here was our draft EIS for the transmission project, so this is -2 here. Here was where we received the approval for our infrastructure on the wind project, so -2 is grumpy and growing. And finally, we received the draft EIS, or the final EIS on the transmission project. So it just kind of gives you a concept of what 8 years is. We all kind of sit around sometimes and complain about it, but the process, it is what it is. We've done it. We did the work. We've got nearly 500,000 man-hours. Put a multiplier on that to figure out what it is, but around 500,000 man-hours invested in this project to date so far. One of the things that's really differentiated the Anschutz Corporation's approach versus other developers is Mr. Anschutz has taken a visionary approach on this project, and he's willing to put his capital to work to entitle this project before we take it to market.
You've been busy too, huh?
I don't have 500,000 man-hours there, though.
So, I'm sorry. I heard a pause.
Just a couple more slides here. So one thing we'd like to talk about is jobs. The project will represent a lot of jobs in Wyoming. The total to build the project is about 10.5 million man-hours of construction jobs for both the wind project and the transmission project. Wind is about 5.5 million man-hours. We think that the wind project, to build the whole thing, is going to take around 8 years. And some years there won't be a lot of activity and we'll have a workforce of around 250 people. Other years it'll get real busy and that will go up to around 950 people. We think the northern terminal to the HVDC terminal, that'll have a peak of around 250 jobs of guys building that. Long term, roughly around 145, 150 permanent jobs in Wyoming. The other thing I'd like to point out is that there is no federal or state subsidy for our wind project. And I think that that has been a point of contention for a long time, but the production tax credit has currently expired. And there's really three ways in which we're paying tax revenue to the state of Wyoming. We've got about $375 million of property taxes that we'll pay over the life of the project, roughly $230 million of sales tax on the equipment that comes in. And then Wyoming is the only state that has a wind production tax. So we'll pay about $170 million in wind production. So overall, around $800 million of tax revenues flowing to the state of Wyoming. So I know there's a lot of coal advocates here, but we can't be that bad. So as I mentioned, our strategy has been to permit first, and as we close in on those goals, we're going to now move towards our commercial strategy and really get the offtake agreements and other commercial arrangements with the California utilities. As Jan mentioned, they are closing in on the 33% RPS. We're hopeful with the 50% RPS that gives us a little more room. We've also have been competing very heavily against solar projects, and I think that Jim can probably offer some support that more solar may not necessarily be better. But I like to tell you that we're competitive on price with solar right now, and just think about a $5 billion project. If it was solar, they would receive a $1.5 billion investment tax credit, and California solar projects also don't pay property tax. That would be another $375 million of tax benefit that a California project's getting that we're not getting, but we can still compete on price. Dr. Naughton had mentioned the diversity benefit, and now I've got a few pages I'd like to share with you on how we think that we can help Wyoming comply with 111D. Or maybe not, because I'd rather see my kids. So with that, I will turn it over to questions.
Question from the audience? Carl, even if you don't ask any questions, you have to at least introduce yourself. We'll get a mic to you here in just a second.
It's not really a question for the panel, but maybe for the board of the Infrastructure Authority. I know I've been attending these meetings for years, and over the years there's been different conversations regarding California's AB 32, legalities here and there. And so I was just in D.C. At a meeting of the Western Attorney Generals. It was a port meeting. On the energy export meeting, but they had discussed some of the legal issues that are around the Interstate Commerce Clause and also the Dormant Commerce Clause, and that there are some traction in some of the states that have copied California's AB 32, Minnesota, I think Colorado, Oklahoma. Had copied some of the standards and those their law, and they got struck down in the last year or two. So, as the board, would they be looking at revisiting the legality of AB 32 and if some of the kinks in that law get struck down, especially the parts that limit out-of-state renewables? Most of the AB 32 will probably stay intact, but like Oklahoma's law that got struck down, that specifically said it limited to 10%, I think, of out-of-state renewables. And so I think that's one of the issues that our projects are coming up against, was that 25% could only come from out-of-state, and the rest had to be in-state renewables from California. So will you guys be looking at that as an issue moving forward?
I'll be happy to address that, Daniel. So the way AB 32 is written, Wyoming wind qualifies for bucket one, which is in-state resources. So because our first point of interconnect will be into the CalISO system, just like a first point interconnect of a California wind project, there's no difference. So, and the California Energy Commission has even weighed in on that. So it's really to our benefit for AB 32 not to be struck down. And I'd be happy to hear any other comments from folks on the panel or in the crowd, either one.
Ms. Jan, I guess within California, because I've raised the same point about the Commerce Clause impacts, and it seems to me like somebody could make a legitimate case out of this. I have heard attorneys actually on the other side saying it's crafted in a way that it's immune from challenges. But if somebody, so far as I know, nobody has actually physically challenged it in court yet. And that would be the next step.
We should be careful not to conflate AB 32 with the renewable portfolio standard. They're different things. And the buckets are in the renewable portfolio standard laws, which do not eliminate out-of-state imports. It may make them less preferred, but as Lloyd said, Wyoming projects with DC lines would be in the preferred category. So that's not something you'd want to change. AB 32 is the climate law that sets a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. They're different laws. So you don't want to strike down AB 32 anyway, because that's where your market's going to come from. But the renewable portfolio standard law will probably be adjusted, and it's in the process of being adjusted right now in the California legislature. And I think we're going to see a lot more openness, and we are seeing a lot more openness in California to more regional approaches. The E3 study that was mentioned earlier, I believe in Dr. Naughton's presentation, really pointed out that the cost to California of trying to meet its renewable energy standards and its greenhouse gas emissions targets completely in state would be extremely high. Can you do it? Probably. Would you want to? Not really, because of the way the cost profile would work. The value proposition we've just heard about for Wyoming wind really is a winner when you start to look at it in that kind of a context of reducing the overall cost of compliance across the board in California. So just a little bit of clarification. And Lloyd, thank you for giving me a chance to stand up here and thank you. Because you and I met a number of years ago in Washington, D.C., and we started talking about this very thing, how to create a value proposition for Wyoming wind. And you've been a great leader for the Infrastructure Authority, and you've become a good friend to me, which I deeply appreciate. And I think the things that we've tried to do together have been good for Wyoming, good for the West, and good for California, too. So I just wanted to take that opportunity to thank you. And having been your guest many times at these meetings, how valuable I've found them. So thank you.
Well, Carl, and thank you for your support over the years. I mean, the jury's in. It makes all the sense in the world for Wyoming wind to flow to California. So we're hopeful that the folks in your fine state will come to that conclusion, and let's get this project built.
I understand the point about that Wyoming wind can very much qualify for bucket one based on the way the lines are designed. But I have heard it suggested by some in the state of California that under the new 50% RPS, there might be something more stringent restricting out-of-state wind from coming in. Is that true from your perspective? Is that at all being discussed?
It's so speculative right now because the laws are being drafted. They're not established yet. And I do not believe that it'll be more restrictive for out-of-state wind. And if anything, I think it will be less restrictive.
Okay.
We'll have to see how it all shakes out. There's a lot of political dynamics here, and Danny can tell you about the dynamics involving California labor, which are themselves complex and not monolithic. But I do believe there's a greater understanding. The governor has talked about more regional coordination. He's become an advocate for it. Mary Nichols, the chairman of the Air Resources Board, who is responsible for implementing the greenhouse gas reduction law, has spoken very strongly and supported regional markets to help facilitate kind of interregional trades, very rapid interregional trades through market constructs. We've heard the same thing from the chairman of the California Energy Commission and the California Independent System Operator. I don't think we're going to go backwards on this. I think we're going to go forward. There will be probably some conversation about protecting California jobs, but I think as you saw on one of the slides about overgeneration, if you want to build more generation in California and it's producing in certain hours of the day, you better have some place to send it or you're not going to be building it in California. So I mean, there's a real value proposition here for Wyoming, but also from within California. California won't be just a drop-off place for energy anymore. It'll be helping states throughout the West comply with the Clean Power Plan, get rid of some of the least efficient fossil generating plants in their stacks, which is PacifiCorp is considering. One of the reasons they want to join the ISO is so that they can retire some of their less efficient generators and get access to that solar energy, which, by the way, if they're producing too much at a different hour, at a certain hour, that is very, very cheap power, sometimes negatively priced. So they'll rather shut them off than generate it. Well, if you're going to have an industry that creates jobs in the state, you need a market that facilitates that. That's more regional coordination, not less.
You got to figure, if prices are negative, people are going to figure out they can open up their garage doors and their refrigerator doors and heat up their pool in December and do things like that. So they'll find a way to use it.
My name is Wendy. Can I address one thing? I think there's people in California beginning to understand that their insular approach to this is actually hindering the movement of renewables in the region. And some of the labor movement is a bit of a lagging indicator on this, but the concepts that Jan said about we're actually going to provide more jobs if we spread this around will help bring them along.
Question here.
And my name is Wendy Lau, and my question has to do not with how California is going to meet their clean power plan, but how Wyoming will. And it has been discussed that the Chokecherry project really, the turbines will be located in Wyoming and the DC line will go to Nevada and California. But because there is no off-ramp, nothing related to that project can be used to reach our target. Is that correct?
All right, I'll step on that one. So as far as I know, in this room, the EPA Clean Power Plan 111D doesn't exist. So if it did exist, then there is the option that the states can come up with a regional solution. So the way I would view it is that there would be something where that Wyoming should get some credit for it, but they would have to work it out with the off-taker if the law were to, or if the law were to move forward.
This is directed at the operations guys. You indicated the diversity factor of 0.5 helps the manageability of the grid. Do you have a sense for what you'd like it to be in order for the grid to be where you want it to be? Ultimately, this gets going to get down to some goal setting which is ultimately going to set the strategy for the mix of production assets, what you buy, what you generate, et cetera.
Well, to answer that question, yeah, let me get a little closer here. The question is what would I like to have the diversity factor go down to? And today I don't have an acknowledgement of what that would be. I do know that if you do look back in time, and part of my report recommended to the utilities to take a look back of 3 to 5 years to see what it looked like in relative variability back before renewables were added to the grid. There still may be some variability that was occurring on the old system. I don't know what that number looks like, but it would be advantageous for us to plan ahead to take us back to that point and not just allow the onset of more and more and more variability on the system. So at least
get to zero.
No, I don't see us getting to zero, but I don't know what that number is.
Question here.
I had one question, but before I pose it to Jan, one comment about the California situation as it relates to the growing developments of the formation of a much larger regional market. I mean, we often hear about this question, will California absorb Wyoming wind, or for that matter, any other renewable energy resource that's built outside of the Golden State? Well, the realistic answer to that is that while it's important for California to be a market, another market is forming, and that is the West. And with PacifiCorp looking closely at joining, APS, Arizona Public Service, is going to join, Puget is going to join, and it's sort of inexorable, a movement towards a much larger market, which also addressed Ms. Lowe's comment about the Clean Power Plan and how things will develop in the West. So there's a kind of interdependence that's developing here with the development of solar, development of wind, and geothermal throughout the West. It's starting to meld together. But here's my question to Jan. You got my attention when you talked about SDG&E's solar PV rooftop deployment, and I think you said 300 and some odd megawatts. Lloyd and I did a quick research survey, and the California Energy Commission has a penetration of 4,425 megawatts between you, Edison, PG&E, and SMUD by 2024. That's pretty significant.
I think you said it all. I mean, it's actually driving our company to really think hard about the business model, frankly, because obviously utility, survives on the revenues it gets from retail sales, and as your retail sales disappear, you're spreading your fixed costs across a smaller and smaller number of megawatt hours, so it really changes the way you think about your business.
They're just responding to the rates, I think. So, question here.
Yeah, David Scheida, Southern California Edison. Just a question for the Transwest project. How are you going to recover the costs for the project? That's one question. And then for that Transwest or the others, this FERC Order 1000 interregional transmission planning process, do you think that will help, hurt, or do nothing to this challenge here about regional planning?
I think Danny mentioned I'm the finance guy. No, I'm sorry. David Smith, he's our director. Sorry, David Smith is our director of engineering. He's around here somewhere. I think he may have stepped up. Maybe afterwards you can catch up with him. But as far as the cost allocation, the customers of the line, the off-takers of the energy, are ultimately going to pay for the transmission.
So is that like a commercial model where you sell usage, if you will, of the line? Is that off-taker type? Or?
That's one approach.
Dave, I would just...
Any other questions?
I would just add that that's a voluntary, Order 1000 is, in the event people can't voluntarily reach agreement on the cost allocation, that's when that could take effect. So just a detail there.
Carl, did you have something else?
Just one thing on Order 1000, it can really help make rational decisions about these kinds of lines. You have 4 different regional planning entities that will have to coordinate across the Western Interconnection to make decisions about lines that are needed. Some of the decisions will be about meeting public policy goals. The Clean Power Plan compliance would be part of that. If Wyoming were engaged in an effort to trade some of the compliance credits, that's one of the strategies to make regional approaches work. That actually can help them quite a bit in approving a line and also then on cost allocation, spreading it out over many, many more people who would be beneficiaries of that by virtue of their joint compliance strategies. So Order 1000 can be a very powerful tool, not only in getting lines like this approved when they're multi-state lines, but really helping to more appropriately identify the beneficiaries based upon a much broader context of where the value lies.
So Danny, Jim, Jan, John, and Jeff, thank you so much, gentlemen. Let's give them a hand, please.
Just